we're just going to take a moment and get set up for our keynote, which just involves me doing that. And we will make a quick transition straight into Lily's keynote, if that's okay. We've got a packed schedule this morning, but yeah, so this is now time. Thanks, Lily. That's coming up perfect. Yeah, this is the first of our 2 keynotes today on the final day for the main program of PDC 2022. And we're really thrilled and excited to have Lilly Irani with us. Lilly is someone that for many of us, her work has really inspired and demonstrated to us, I think, how critical studies of technology and tech innovation can have a direct line to practice and initiatives that enable change in the conditions of work and labor and participation in the digital and data society. Sadly, as you can tell, Lily cannot join us in Newcastle today for the keynote due to unexpected reasons, but we must give an absolute huge thank you to Lily, who is zooming into us this morning for us, but at midnight for her on the Pacific side of the United States. So Lily, thank you so much. But I should actually do the official introduction first of all, for any of you that do not know who Lily is. So Lilly Irani is an associate professor of communication and science studies at University of California, San Diego, where she co-directs the Just Transitions Initiative. She is author of Chasing Innovation, Making Entrepreneurial Citizens in Modern India, with Jesse Marks. Chasing Innovation has been awarded the 2020 International Communication Association Outstanding Book Award and the 2019 Diana Forsyth Prize for Feminist Anthropological Research on Work, Science, or Technology, including biomedicine. Her research examines the cultural politics of high-tech work and the counter practices they generate as both an ethnographer, a designer, and a former technology worker herself. She is a co-founder of the digital worker advocacy organization Turkopticon and organizes the Take Workers Coalition San Diego and the Transparent Responsible Use of Surveillance Technology Coalition. Again, we're really excited and so happy that Lily's joined us today. And Lily, I will hand over straight to you, if that's okay.
All right, thank you so much. Yeah, I really wish that I could be there in person. I'm recovering from COVID and it's pretty late over here, so I apologize for anything that comes out fuzzy, and I really look forward to your questions and dialogue after this. And then finally, also, it's really amazing to be here in particular because the work of the Participatory Design Conference has been a huge source of like strength and possibility for me. You know, like there's the PDC communities are the ones who've articulated the importance of political economy in shaping the conditions in which we have voice to shape technologies. And so I hope that is clear today in my talk. And I hope that I can be with you all in person sometime soon. So to begin my talk, I wanted to begin with an acknowledgement as requested. I'm speaking to you from the unceded territory of the Kumeyaay Nation that spans across and precedes the US-Mexico border here in the San Diego-Tijuana border region. The Tribal Chairmen's Association where I live includes 25 tribes or bands of Kumeyaay, Mission, Luiseño, Cahuilla, and Chemehuevi Paiute nations. This border I live by also cuts across stolen land configured to allow workers to cross with difficulty, well-resourced people to cross with ease, and many to be violently forbidden from crossing at all. My own family crossed this border from Iran back in 1979, leaving in the wake of an anti-colonial revolution there that they had supported, but that had gotten out of hand and that they found themselves stuck in the US as the US underwrote oil wars that continued between Iran and Iraq for a decade. So I come to the work I speak about today with this history of coming to this country under conditions not quite of my family's choosing, as a Muslim woman, as a former tech worker, and as a migrant in a settler country working to unlearn violent inheritances and build power with others to dismantle these. The title of my talk, Claiming Democracy for Digital Infrastructure, centers on the idea that we need to build power if we want to change the digital conditions that we live in. By democracy, I don't mean the Cold War euphemism for capitalist market economies, but a more capacious horizon of worker control over production, economic justice, and good relations with all whom we live with in pluriversal cosmologies. This is a journey that will necessarily be fraught with uncertainty and contradictions, and those will have to be worked out towards good relations as we go. So today, I come to this theme with a kind of frustration that my own training in design and research and coming up with even participatory methods for coming up with good tools alone are ill-equipped to transform the infrastructures that we live with. Instead, I want to argue that we need to address political agency to redirect the technologies that impact our lives. And by political agency, I mean the capacity of agents to create effects through direct and institutional action. To address this, I'll begin by talking about political agency and what I see as some of the limits of design. And I know that people in this community have actually been exploring these issues as well. I learned to articulate some of them from the literature here. And then I'll move through two case studies. The first, a struggle for democratic oversight over city surveillance technology acquisition in San Diego. In this case study, a highly organized set of community organizations already had experience doing racial justice work, and by talking about what tech workers and HCI researchers were able to contribute to this movement, it lets me zoom in on what some of the knowledge and practices that we have in tactical forms are able to contribute to these efforts. The second case study is that of Turkopticon, a decade-old software project that supports Amazon Mechanical Turk workers. I'll show the limits of software in creating political agency for workers and how over the last 2 years, we have turned the project into a worker-led advocacy organization. And that section of the talk is co-authored with Mechanical Turk workers that I organize with. And then I'll wrap up by reflecting on how claiming political agency requires us to learn ways of organizing and relating that are discouraged by post-Fordist production. So when I speak about political agency over digital infrastructures, I focus on infrastructures because of the ways that that's a word that lets us talk about technologies or systems that cut across space and communities, that are invisible to many people as we come to rely on them. And much of what they do affects communities very differently. Different communities have different practices for which they rely on infrastructures, and they also experience different ramifications from the existence of these infrastructures. Both the case of surveillance technology in San Diego is one of many layered infrastructures being taken up by institutions that enforce racialized hierarchies in the United States, and then also the infrastructures of crowdsourcing that are to a large extent controlled by Amazon for the workers that I organize with in the second case. So I want us to think about the kinds of both the invisibility and the expansiveness and the embeddedness of these systems as like what we are confronting. There are many challenges for political agency with infrastructure. Infrastructure has been analyzed as a form of as mere acts of engineering or technocracy, but that can create new forms of sovereignty. In the United States, with the privatization of many public infrastructures, like in many other countries, infrastructures are often have great public implications, but are privately owned and often protected by trade secrets. Also in the United States, in many cases, private companies have captured certain aspects of decision-making by the state, whether at the municipal level or the federal level, as you know, so companies become privileged informants about what the capacities of the technology are for the state. And then those with the training to dissect and trace the infrastructure, those like many of us who've had a lot of public resources invested in our learning about technology are often not the ones most directly harmed. And finally, these infrastructures, because they're invisible to many, they pose a challenge for organizing, because if you can't see it, you might not necessarily be thinking about the impacts. I also want to situate my talk in recent calls for community-led transformation, exemplified. Just here's a few, these are a few samples of works. Digital Dead End by Virginia Eubanks began with the problem of creating a computer literacy center that completely transformed, and the people in the center said that we actually need something different. These are familiar to people in the participatory design community, these kinds of problematics. Design Justice by Sasha Costanza Chalk calls for community control and political accountability for technologies, and calls on us to put technology in service of communities and social movements. Race After Technology centers on race and anti-Blackness in technology, and shows how technology practiced in the service of abolition movements, what that could look like. And Yeshi Milner of Data for Black Lives in the United States gave a talk that was very inspirational to me called Abolish Big Data, where she foregrounded the actions of people in communities at local levels tackling technologies that were violating their privacy or criminalizing their children without any particular technological expertise other than the ones that they had gained through experience and fighting some of these technologies through local politics. I've learned a tremendous amount from these works, but one of the questions I want to pick up on that I think some of these works don't quite, these works walk up to but don't answer is, okay, if we're going to be working with communities, taking leadership from communities as people in technology and research, how can we account for and build the political agency of the communities that we hope to, of the community-based movements we hope to contribute to? And what resources can we offer to strengthen communities' voice and hand? Closer to PDC, I also want to point to the Defund Big Tech Refund Community Manifesto that came out of a 2020 PDC workshop. And this manifesto does a lot to integrate a range of different issues, from antitrust to carceral technologies to the impact of technologies on cities, into something like a platform that shows the connections between issues that might be considered separate. But again, the conversation I would love to have in this community is how we build the power and political agency to actually pursue these platforms and to make sure that these platforms are actually accountable to people who are frontline communities most directly affected by these technologies that we are talking about. So the first case study I want to talk about is how a coalition of community groups, including racial justice organizers and tech worker organizers, came together to subject surveillance infrastructures to democratic oversight in San Diego. This case illustrates a variety of ways we put HCI information studies kinds of knowledge practices to work, contributing to the political agency of an anti-surveillance coalition. This process that I'll talk about in this case study, to borrow from Shana Ahid, drawing on Ann Light and Yoko Akama, was one of continually attuning to what might be of use. So the battle over surveillance technology in San Diego started over a battle over what was called smart streetlights. So these smart streetlights were introduced to San Diego at the last city council meeting of 2016. An economic development staffer in the mayor's office had championed this program as a way. What he told city council was that these streetlights are amazing because they have sensors on them that will turn the lights on and off at the right time, sensing the light. And this will save the city so much money in electricity that it will pay itself back over 10 years for the $30 million loan that San Diego took out to pay for the system. Now, what the mayor's staff did not tell city council when they approved this system with very little debate was that those sensors on the streetlights were not mere light sensors, but were actually cameras and microphones and storage devices mounted on each streetlight that's connected to a cloud and can stream live data, video and audio to control centers. So the civil liberties implications were never discussed. The city did reach out to involve community participation in the system, but the community they reached out to were tech entrepreneur design types. So I had heard about this from the UCSD Design Lab because the mayor's office wanted to evangelize a kind of tech entrepreneurial gentrification form of city development. And so they wanted this community to build apps on this smart streetlight system. But the communities that would be most affected by surveillance because they're surveilled by, say, law enforcement agencies, they were not brought into the discussion. So as the city tried to evangelize this to the kind of tech and what they considered the most economically valuable citizens, they had modes of participation like smart city hackathons to evangelize it. But when they sought to expand the program 3 years later in 2019, they started having meetings in community libraries. And the meetings were titled Technology for Good, San Diego as a Smart City. What I've learned through the work on this project is I think that a bureaucrat who was in a part of the city that knew about these streetlights thought that was really something communities should know about, sort of innocently suggested that they might have some meetings and talk to people about what the program is. And this meeting is one that Khalid Alexander, the founder of a group called Pillars of the Community, found out about. He found out about it because he lives in a community where the police particularly occupy that community. They surveil young Black and Latino men and will label them as being members of gangs, put them in a database, and then this has really dire implications for what happens when these young people get into legal situations, like accused of a crime. Now they're getting accused as gang members instead of just accused, as kind of unmarked citizen. So Khalid knew that surveillance was already a problem in his community, that people were being identified and labeled and databased without their consent or without their knowledge. And so when he found out about the streetlights, he reached out to community organizers across a range of organizations and said, hey, let's go to this meeting. At this meeting, it was mostly the police that were presenting on how they had not known about the streetlights when they were first installed in the city, but since 2017, they had turned them into a crime-fighting tool. And but the police faced a full room of people with really different perspectives and histories in San Diego who were asking them very difficult questions. So one example of the kinds of questions they got is from groups in the parts of San Diego that Khalid lived in, where people had been put into these gang databases. So I remember one Black man had asked, if you're using these cameras for crime fighting, why have you not actually done anything about the murder of my friend who died last year? Someone else asked, do you need a warrant to be able to use these cameras, or can you just use them live? The other person asked, can these cameras look into my private property, into my front yard that has a fence around it? Then the tech workers were bringing other kinds of questions to the table. The tech workers were asking, when the police said that the private property is blocked off by polygons, a tech worker who worked at a big kind of telecommunication hardware company, Qualcomm, asked, is that a software block on filming the property, or is that a hardware block, where the camera is actually placed so it has no access to the private property? So you could ask more technical questions, ask questions about data retention policies. And then and then people who are in Muslim communities in San Diego, they had questions about whether this video data that was produced by these cameras would be shared with federal law enforcement. So for those, I know that this is an international conference. In the United States, after 9/11, 2001, when there were the terrorist attacks in the United States, but actually even before, Muslim communities had been targeted as potentially harboring terrorists. And so there's a range of programs that go under the name sometimes of countering violent extremism programs, organized and funded by the federal government, where law enforcement agents would go undercover and pretend to be members of the community in mosques. They would sometimes, befriend people, young men in the mosques, try to entrap them by suggesting that they engage in violent activity. And then sometimes vulnerable young men would say, well, okay, like you're my friend, so I guess I'll help you. And, then that person would get called a terrorist and arrested. They would keep files, they would trace, charitable donations of these communities. So there had already been an expansive dragnet of surveillance that had infiltrated Muslim communities, had made people scared to talk with one another. Even my own uncle, who was very involved in his Muslim communities and cities that he'd lived in, told me that he had several times been asked by the FBI to become an informant on his community. One time they actually intercepted him as a plane landed and called out his name and asked him to come to a room in the airport to be questioned. So this is something that has affected my family personally. So the Muslim communities in this technology for good session, we're asking, is this data shared with federal law enforcement? Are these cameras being placed around the mosques where we worship? Why were we not consulted? So the different situated knowledges that people brought into the room helped them ask questions about what the technology could do right now, but also to speculate about what the probable futures of these technologies would be based on the forms of institutional practices that they already knew existed that would be interpreting and kind of deploying these technologies in the future. So coming out of this Technology for Social Good meeting was the spark for the Trust Coalition, the Transparent Responsible Use of Surveillance Technologies. It brought together over 30 groups building on racial justice coalitions, immigrant rights coalitions, but also bringing in civil liberties groups, pro-privacy groups, even conservatives who didn't like the idea of big government spying on them. So it became a really unusual combination of people coming together. And the goal of the coalition was to subject surveillance technology to oversight. We knew that the surveillance streetlights were only one example of many surveillance technologies that were being sold to cities by overzealous and profiteering private companies. And so we didn't want to just shut down or get control over the streetlights. We actually wanted to know about and have a voice in all of them. And so we wrote an ordinance. We wrote an ordinance that was heavily modeled after one that was already operating in Oakland and in Seattle. And what the ordinance called for was that every surveillance technology the city is considering acquiring, whether they're paying for it or it's being given to them, has to go through the advice of a privacy advisory board. The privacy advisory board asks the city to write up the use policy that would determine the policies that would govern how the technology would be used and essentially set the rules. And then the technology proposal from the city would also have to come with an impact report that would look at civil liberties impacts, financial impacts, potential differential impacts on people based on race, ethnicity, or religion. And also it asks the question of, have you considered other solutions, especially non-technological solutions to this problem? So the Privacy Advisory Board takes those documents and writes its own report about the adequacy of those documents or makes recommendations. The board has seats on it for people with expertise in accounting, technology, law, open data, and transparency, but it also crucially has almost half the seats, 4 seats reserved for people from communities who have historically been subject to surveillance, because their situated knowledge, in the ways I've explained, is really important to projecting the possible dangers of these technologies. So these ordinances have been instituted in, I think, something like 17 cities now, and in some cases they're characterized as a kind of a liberal device for bringing many perspectives to the table to deliberate over privacy and technology use. But for many of us in the coalition, it was fundamentally a tool because it would render transparent surveillance acquisitions that we wouldn't even know about otherwise, and it would slow down the process of surveillance acquisition in a way that would make more contentious forms of organizing possible. So a liberal tool that could enable other kinds of politically oriented groups to have the time and space to organize and create counter knowledge about these technologies. So what we kind of felt out as we worked in the coalition as tech workers and also the students in my lab was how could we as HCI researchers and tech workers strengthen the coalition's work? So one way we strengthen the coalition's work is by providing counter expertise. So the city was claiming that, and actually General Electric, the maker of the system, was claiming that the city owned all the data. One of the students I worked with at the time, Cedric Whitney, now at Berkeley, did a public records request, got the contract, and found out that actually the contract the city signed does give the city ownership to all of the data, the source data that comes in through the cameras and the microphones, but actually General Electric owns all right, title, and interest to the process data. So when we first went to the city and said, hey, actually General Electric owns essentially a copy of all the data and certainly any models and techniques that come out of it, an anonymous source in the city called us liars, but because we had enough technology workers and also technology lawyers in our network, we were able to kind of mount a counterclaim and speak for technology in a Latourian sense. We also created community forums after community forums after community forums together that brought together people with very different situated knowledges about technology to talk to wider communities about why we should be concerned and why we should seek a voice with this. These community forums became not only a place to educate the community, of course, they were also a place for the people in the community who attended to speak about what their hopes for these technologies were, what they would want instead, and also for the people in the coalition to hear from each other, where technology workers who might not know a lot about gang profiling and racism in Southeast San Diego could hear from each other. As technology workers and human-computer interaction researchers, we were also doing the work of legitimating community demands through speaking at city council, through writing op-eds. Now, I believe that we should not live in a society where community demands are delegitimized as lacking in expertise, but our legitimation of community demands was something that the coalition members welcomed, and we articulated our legitimation in ways that also legitimated community knowledge about these technologies. So we could do the work of legitimation at the same time as we try to dismantle the hierarchy that makes us privileged speakers for the community's claims. We also engaged in some speculative research. This is actually weirdly not the least important thing to, I think, the coalition members, but it was helpful for our thinking. And this is echoes of Shana Ahid's paper about their work with critical resistance, where the things that the designers want to do are not the things that the activists find particularly useful. But just in the ways that the community coalition members were using their experiences of surveillance of Muslims or surveillance of Black and Latino San Diegans to project what could be done with the technology. My students and I had a hackathon we called the Slightly Dystopian Hackathon. And so we took the APIs, the programming interfaces that provided the streetlight data of pedestrian counts, bus counts, car counts, and we tried to make applications that were very doable, but also creepy. We did this because often when we were talking to city officials, they were saying, well, this is just planning data that's being provided publicly. It's not you can't do anything bad with it. And so we wanted to show that you could take really banal seeming data and you could build things like, private company algorithms to have surge prices for parking downtown based on the kind of traffic numbers. Or the app that we ended up prototyping was an app that would find people who are walking by themselves and are vulnerable for being targeted, called Someone Walks Home Alone at Night. So these demos that we made ended up kind of helping us think through what we ended up usually recounting as stories when we testified to council or we talked to journalists. We didn't end up showing the demos so much. And finally, we produced bespoke policy reports. One of the discoveries from our demo hackathon, the Slightly Dystopian demos, was actually that the smart streetlights promised planning data on pedestrian, car, bus, and bike counts, the pedestrian counts actually didn't even work. Turns out that the planning department already knew this. This data was not useful for them for their sustainability planning. But when we found out about it, we talked to a journalist. The journalist ended up writing a story about it that strengthened the arguments of the coalition with those who thought, who might think the streetlights are a waste of money. And basically in like 48 hours turnaround, we were asked to write a policy memo describing our research findings. And this was something that the city council allies could cite from the dais, documenting the knowledge the coalition was creating together, but with the imprimatur of a university on it. And finally, we engaged in a bit of culture jamming. So most recently, this surveillance ordinance fight actually, it was going even through this summer. In the United States, abortion is now illegal in some states because our Supreme Court struck down a particular private decision in our case law that protected privacy called Roe versus Wade, or I guess Dobbs is the decision. And so we took up the concerns about reproductive rights, and we actually made a newspaper from the future for city council, asking them whether they were going to pass the surveillance ordinance in its strongest form, or were they going to make last-minute loopholes that were going to make the city leak abortion data all across the US, potentially criminalizing people seeking reproductive health services in California from neighboring states. And so this was a poster that was collaboratively designed by Lydia Ekaroth, Lorena Gomez-Mostajo, and me. So through these and many more efforts of many organizations, the coalition mostly won what we were asking for. Actually, the surveillance ordinance we were asking for only got signed into law at the beginning of this month. I think something like 2.5 years later. It came with a loophole for federal law enforcement that I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A that we were not happy about. However, the process of organizing for this ordinance, countering a lot of the kinds of arguments that the police were throwing at us about why this ordinance was a problem, fighting the federal law enforcement task force loophole, that fight for many of us revealed a more honest and shared analysis of how the city and how its institutions work. There's a way in which organizing, when you're really putting pressure to change something, is radicalizing because you kind of see the things that you don't really want to believe are true about how our institutions work. Also, the product of this effort was not just the ordinance, was not just the shared analysis, but it was also organizers across the city forming present and what Yoko Akama and Light call future social relations, relationships that have been built and trust that's been built through organizing, through people who didn't know each other, that can also be then used for organizing more effectively and powerfully in the future. So these relationships, analyses, and practices expand our political agency and prepare us for the next struggle over demanding participation in the technologies that we live with. So I want to then transition to a second case of a decade-long project in which software and research helped workers gain some power, but also over a decade, the software became a band-aid for a flawed system. This section of my talk was co-developed with Amazon Mechanical Turk workers that I organize with. For a future of work with good conditions for AI workers, we need to invest the most basic resources in workers so they can take time and create their own spaces to organize for change. If the previous case study was about what happens when there is already a basis of organization among racial justice coalitions and tech workers are joining and contributing to it, this next case is about what happens when tech workers want to contribute to efforts, but there isn't necessarily a collective that's organized to really lead the tech workers that want to work in solidarity. So, this is, for those of you who are familiar with my work, this is going to be a case study about what's happened with the Turkopticon project over the last 2 years as it's transitioned from software to worker-led organizing. So for those who are not familiar with Mechanical Turk, what is Mechanical Turk and why does it exist? AI promises autonomous, almost magical automation delivered by heroic engineers and compute power at command. This is a myth and it hides many workers who make AI work. 15 years ago, Silicon Valley companies were starting to face this reality head on. Trained as a computer scientist, I had worked at Google for a few years, and there I never met, but I knew there were workforces who pitched in when automation failed or helped to train automation in the first place. At Google, they helped tune a new search algorithm by judging which set of search results were better. These workers made sure advertisers' web pages did not violate Google's policies, content policies. And I had friends who worked at similar companies and startups who also relied on this invisible workforce. There, the engineers face challenges like teaching a computer how to see the difference between pornography or not pornography, something even judges have a famously difficult time with. Sometimes they needed people to help convert YouTube audio to text so search engines could search it, or they needed workers to check and correct error-prone automated transcriptions. As tech companies were encouraging all of us to upload more and more of our lives onto their servers, the companies had trouble understanding and organizing it all. And these were tasks that were easy for people to do, but hard for computers to do. And that is why this workforce of gig workers who assist in data transcription and classification became really crucial. So Amazon, one of the companies that faced this problem, built a system called Amazon Mechanical Turk. What Amazon Mechanical Turk did was create a platform that allowed engineers and academics to upload huge volumes of data tasks to the site and then set a piece rate, a price per task, such as a penny per faded receipt a worker is supposed to transcribe. Then workers would come to this website from their homes and they would look at the jobs that were available, the cost of the jobs, and they would try to pick who to work for. Now, in trying to pick who to work for, there's a lot of information the Amazon site did not provide. Was this employer problematic in how they treated workers? What does that 12 cents per task really mean? Does that task take an hour for 12 cents or does it take 1 minute for 12 cents? You have really no idea what those wages add up to. Six Silberman and I were grad students at the time, and we put out a survey asking Turk workers, what are the things that they like about their work, and what are the things that they would like to change about their work. And even though there is a lot of diversity in what workers wanted, some workers did not want minimum wage, some workers really wanted minimum wage. One of the things that workers really agreed on was that there was a problem where the employers could basically take the work that workers had done and just unilaterally decide not to pay for it. And when employers decided to do this in mass, when an employer decided not to pay for any of the work that they had acquired from workers on the platform, this is what Turk workers called mass rejections. So to help workers protect one another from employers that treated them badly, Six and I responded in the ways that we knew how. We designed a website and a browser tool. And what this tool did was allow workers, basically, when a worker was browsing the Amazon website, it would embed a button on the website. And that button would see, okay, which employer's task is the worker looking at? Let's search the Turkopticon database for reviews that have been written by other workers about their experience with this employer. And so a worker in situ on the platform could pull reviews and decide whether they wanted to risk working for this employer or not. This site was also crucially run by community moderators who were themselves workers, and it was all volunteer run, basically on fumes. We ran the site for about 10 years. Mechanical Turk workers helped with day-to-day policy decisions and community moderation, but there's a lot that the software did not do. A negative review that a worker had uploaded meant that the worker had already suffered in some way. Some worker had to try out the new employers and report on how it went so other workers could avoid if that employer was the problem. The site also encouraged workers to share information as individuals, but it did nothing to synthesize across employer reviews to find common issues that might require a more systemic solution. The software could bring agreements or disagreements about specific employers to the surface, but it couldn't facilitate a consensus or find common points of action. A decade later, tens of thousands of workers had used Turkopticon. Many told us it helped allay anxieties that they had as they worked. A labor economist even did an empirical experiment and estimated the workers who used this reputation system earned 40% more than those who didn't. But a decade later, the rejections of workers' work, their wage theft, had not gone away. The AI economy had only expanded and grown more flush with money, but Turk workers did not have an organized voice in the discussions of policy, in discussions of policymakers, employers, or at Amazon. It felt a little bit like we had spent 10 years building a mutual aid tool that had become a band-aid for a broken and exploitative corner of the academic industrial complex. So in 2019, Six and I decided to turn Turkopticon into a worker-led and maintained project. We held a series of workshops to enlist workers interested in taking over and governing and reorienting the project. We explained our concerns about software as a band-aid, ameliorating tensions, but not addressing upstream sources of harm. And we got a grant that allowed us to pay workers $15 an hour, working with us to learn how to organize, to plan a transition, and to build a team focused on a shared vision. Over the last 2 years, this has been a transition away from being a software project run by a designer, an engineer, and a few worker moderators to an organizing project run by a growing team of Amazon Mechanical Turk workers with funding to support the time, trainings, and conversations needed to learn the organizing skills neither Turking nor engineering training gave us. Over the past 2 years, the team of organizers has accomplished a lot. There's been several organizers who've taken leadership and have been brave and willing to speak and write publicly about these issues. Worker organizers canvass Turker forums and do one-on-one conversations to understand what the broader needs and concerns among workers are. They facilitate forums to develop creative proposals to long-standing problems. And they work with a group of software engineers from Tech Worker Coalition to operate and make improvements to the software features and stability. They have a network of mentors who help them strategize. Six and I can get hit by a bus, and not only will Turkopticon survive, but it'll actually be able to address problems the software couldn't. So moving forward, we've given up hope that software and information sharing will spontaneously generate a coordinated strategy for change. Those were the dreams many had for Facebook, blogs, and Twitter, that many individuals sharing online could enable the envisioning and pursuit of political change. We've all seen this dream crash hard. Organizing work is not just about communication or even engagement, but about creating focus, consensus, and trust relationships. I'm convinced that this is what is essential for a future of work and a future of technology that works for workers and works for the people who have to live with the implications of the technology. Organizing is what allows communities to puncture the attention of experts and professionals to be heard. The organizing from workers themselves is not substitutable by the expert advocacy of pro-labor academics or even large unions. A lot of the topics that are on the labor agenda in the United States, at least around the gig economy, are absolutely do not see some of the very specific issues like mass rejections that Amazon Mechanical Turk workers deal with, or account suspensions by algorithm that not only Mechanical Turk, but also Uber and Lyft drivers deal with. So workers have to be organizing to create a voice that articulates the problems that most affect the concrete conditions of their daily lives. And I would like to argue that we need to do what we can to support them materially. Turk workers have a long road ahead, including coming up with proposals to the mass rejection problem. They tell me a good solution needs to uplift good faith work, exclude workers who spam and threaten the integrity of their craft, and prevent baseless rejections, and also repair harm to workers when it does happen. Proposals have to navigate how work interacts with workers' disability benefits, workers' ability to juggle caregiving responsibilities, or a host of other considerations that only come out when people start evaluating different ways of tackling the problem. Improving their work conditions means accounting for these unanticipated dependencies. Good designers are trained to recognize this complexity, but they're rarely accountable to the users on whose behalf they advocate. We are rarely accountable to those who pay. We are often rarely accountable we're often most accountable to those who pay for our time. I know like whether that's the institutions that pay us to teach people how to do research or teach people how to design, or sometimes the companies where we have our day jobs. As Six and I built and maintained Charcopticon over a decade, we tried to be accountable to workers, but ultimately our day jobs in the academy prevented us from communicating enough to see the complexities they were navigating and make decisions that were truly accountable to them. Yet Six and I found that we were the ones that were being invited to convenings put on by policymakers, academics, and even tech companies to speak about the problems of Turk work. This is a problem. In the US, there's a long history of policy bodies or journalists consulting by the book experts, managers, engineers, and academics to speak on issues of public concern. Today, we can add nonprofits that are run by such by the book experts to fuel what Meredith Whittaker of AI Now has called the critical academic industrial complex. Such convenings channel resource investments into by the book experts like us, rather than developing workers' own ability to collectively speak for themselves. Six and I tried resisting this, getting organizers and journalists to invite AMT workers to speak, Turkers to speak. Sometimes they did, but this created its own problems when invited workers advocated a point of view not broadly supported by other workers back on the Turk forums. The product of such inclusion efforts, when not backed by collective organizing and consensus building among communities, was conflict and mistrust by those who felt they were misrepresented. The mistrust was both towards the workers who were speaking for them and the convening bodies themselves. So a future of work that is good for workers requires us to invest in workers' collective capacities to pursue changes to the problems they face in their own workplaces. This includes giving workers time off the job to imagine, communicate, organize, strategize, and design. We should not be looking to academics or designers like me and Six, no matter how good our intentions, to represent their will. We should not be cherry-picking individual workers as a voice in the room, outsourcing the burdens of representing a group onto a token person's shoulders. So then how could we as designers and tech workers strengthen the workers' organizing work? Well, what worker organizers are asking us to do is instead give money to sustain organizing. Only after workers create shared agendas can our other skills, tools, or institutional legitimacy support them. That can be a hard thing for us to hear because we're trained to change ideas and theories about the world through our teaching and writing and our project work. Certainly donating money is not anything that I've ever had as part of a conversation about how we build political capacities around technology. But in this case, these are the very material resources that would enable workers to become strong partners who can create leadership around the futures of technology that they want. Solidarity, not charity, means we give not because others are worse off than us, but because we recognize that the system that harms workers is also a system that alienates us and in our labors, and that system needs to change. So I want to conclude by talking about how both these cases are about claiming political agency, which requires us to learn new ways of organizing and relating to each other and to the communities that we're part of and we are in solidarity with. So for me, a lot of this thinking was driven by a kind of parallel process of being steeped in the kinds of ideals and histories of participatory design, but also in the research that I did on design and entrepreneurship in my book, Chasing Innovation, I saw that there were ways that the innovation economy tried to organize us as designers and kind of shape our relations to each other and to the communities that we design with in ways that were productive for the innovation economy and did not challenge the projects of accumulation of that economy. So some characteristics of how the innovation economy kind of projects ask us to relate to each other in design thinking and hackathons can be privileging a design and managerial agenda over truly shared control with the communities we co-design with. It can, and this is like all just old news to a lot of you, but I just like want to lay this as groundwork for the conversation. It also encourages us to channel our sense of injustice into entrepreneurial design initiatives that actually don't pose a significant power challenge to the overarching agenda. You know, for like I would argue that the Turkopticon project, you know, when I say that after 10 years it became a band-aid, you know, it ran the risk of becoming something that really wasn't challenging the political economy. It was actually providing outsourced worker support that Amazon should have been providing through better policies and staffing. The innovation economy asks us to organize our sense of community into contained projects rather than connected power building movements. And then it also constructs roles, designers and users, rather than collective governance. And I know there's been work. I saw a paper by Fabiana Tomosini-Gianni and Ingrid Mulder and practice that and reflection and action to reconstruct the role of the designer by learning from the practices and processes of the oppressed. And so this, you know, I'm really heartened by these efforts of all of us to kind of unlearn these expert user roles and deconstruct them in new ways. These are two books that for me had important lessons and models for how to ground the technology kind of the claim making over technology infrastructures in processes of organizing. So Jane McAlevey is a labor organizer and a political scientist, and in her book No Shortcuts, she argues that one problem with the labor movement in the United States has been that it has commonly in recent decades taken policy and law shortcuts to make rights or claims without taking the time to organize workers, involving them in negotiations, or having workers work on issues that they feel are the most pressing. So a lot of the well-meaning digital policy-oriented work to create new rights, when it doesn't involve the people who would be the rights bearers and the claim makers in deciding whether those are the actual rights they want, it can make a movement feel like they've accomplished something, but actually there isn't really broad-based support or understanding for those rights. They might not even be the right outcomes. Ruth Gilmore is a geographer who, for me, is somebody who grew up in and has done a lot of, like lived most of my life in California in the United States. She offers a history of my own state and how carceral policies and infrastructures are an outcome of multiple crises of surplus labor, surplus land, and surplus populations, people who are out of work because of trade policies. And she describes the activism of mothers who are working to keep their children out of prison as a form of reproductive labor in the household that demands structural transformation. So for me, like both of these books offer a kind of multi-scalar analysis that both identifies different opportunities for collective action at different levels, and also prioritizes and foregrounds the kinds of collective work of all kinds that goes into making structural changes. Participatory design also has multi-scalar roadmaps that I've learned so much from. So the 1996 paper by Gertner and Wagner, Mapping Actors and Agendas, identifies 3 arenas of participatory design impact: the project arena of designing and system building concerns, the company arena, which included bargaining and informing union stewards who represented workers to the company, and the national arena, in which participatory design movements work to secure legal rights for workers to shape technology and work. And this history of participatory design projects that try to work at all 3 levels is really exciting to me. And I'm very hopeful about this conference as a space to ask then, now 20 years later, what might a transnational technology agenda for climate justice against settler colonialism and pluriversal economic democracy be when the projects tackle those 3 levels at the same time? Looking back to the demand to defund big tech and refund communities that came out of the PDC 2020 workshop, that is pointing us to some of this multi-scalar analysis. And I'm really excited to continue building and connecting our collective movements and projects to build more power to actually achieve some of those features. So in conclusion, I've offered a call to think about participation as the work of building political agency through organizing that creates conditions for collective voice and the political power necessary to actually transform the designs that we live with. And when we ask what we can offer to communities building power, it may not look very much like design. I offer not these ideas because they're original or I'm the first to offer them, but because they're important to me to make the world more survivable for myself, my neighbors, and my loved ones. And I'm excited to raise these questions for the collective convened here to see what conversations and projects we can build in the decades to come. Thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to the discussion.